You know, I've had 4 terrible years, as most of people know now, and it was horrific. My best quote is, I can say that I would never wish that on my worst enemy.
Yeah.
It was tumultuous, horrific, emotionally draining, traumatic.
They say fame means being loved by millions. But Cliff Richard is proof that millions of fans can scream your name, and you can still go home alone. He sold more than 250 million records. He was knighted by the Queen. He filled stadiums, topped charts, and became one of Britain's most beloved entertainers. But behind the applause was a man quietly carrying a loneliness he rarely allowed the world to see. This is not just the story of a rock star. It is the story of a man who spent his life searching for love, safety, and belonging, only to realize that fame could give him everything except the one thing he needed most. And to understand why Cliff Richard, a man who seemed to have it all, still felt something missing, we have to go back to where it began. To his childhood in India, where his earliest dreams and deepest fears first took shape. From India to Abbey Road, the boy without a home. Cliff Richard was born on October 14, 1940, in Lucknow, India, during the final years of British rule. Back then, his name was Harry Webb. His father worked for the Indian Railways, and the family lived comfortably, surrounded by sunshine, servants, and the familiar smells of home. Then, everything changed. In 1947, India gained independence, and the Webb family was forced to leave. They boarded the SS Ranchi and spent 3 weeks crossing the ocean to a cold Britain that young Harry had never even seen before. That first night in England, lying awake in his grandmother's house in Surrey, Harry quietly cried under the blankets. He missed the heat, the sounds, and the smells of India. Even as a child, he already felt like he didn't belong anywhere. Years later, the stage would become the only place where he truly felt at home. The family's new life in post-war England was harsh. They moved into a small council house in Hertfordshire. Money was so tight that several nights a week, dinner was nothing more than hot tea and sugar sprinkled on toast. During those meals, Harry would secretly give part of his food to his younger sister Joan. Before he was even 10 years old, he had already learned how to sacrifice. His father, Roger Webb, was strict and intimidating. According to later accounts, he sometimes punished Cliff with a leather belt. Cliff rarely spoke about it publicly, but many biographers later wondered if those childhood fears shaped the way he struggled with love and emotional closeness for the rest of his life. Then, when Cliff was 16, his father shocked him by buying him a guitar. For a struggling family, it was an enormous expense. Cliff would later say it became his most treasured possession. One small act of love changed the course of his entire life. On July 24, 1958, a 17-year-old Harry Webb walked into Abbey Road Studios with a brand new stage name, Cliff Richard. The session was supposed to focus on another song, but when Cliff recorded Move It, the atmosphere inside the studio completely changed. The song exploded across Britain and turned him into the country's first true rock and roll star. That afternoon launched a career that would last more than 6 decades. But even as fame, money, and success poured into his life, the loneliness inside him never truly disappeared. And in 1961, just as Cliff Richard was becoming one of the biggest stars in Britain, something unexpected happened. No one sees the shadow behind the spotlight. Roger Webb died in 1961. Cliff was only 21 years old. The strict father who once sacrificed to buy his son a guitar never lived long enough to see him become a star. He passed away just as Cliff began performing in front of massive crowds. To this day, Cliff has never publicly revealed his father's final words to him. At 21, Cliff stood on stage with thousands screaming his name, while the one man he most wanted to impress was gone. What followed was one of the greatest careers in British music history. Cliff Richard scored 68 top 10 singles in the UK, including 14 #1 hits and 4 Christmas #1s. He was eventually knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. For decades, almost every household in Britain knew his name. But there was one place that never fully accepted him: America. The media called him the British Elvis, but the United States never truly embraced him. His polished image clashed with the rebellious rock culture exploding across America in the 1960s. Every time he toured there, the crowds seemed smaller. The applause felt quieter. Cliff understood a very specific kind of loneliness, getting close to the throne, but never being allowed to sit on it. Then came another painful twist. In the early 1960s, a young band from Liverpool began rising fast: the Beatles. Early on, they admired Cliff, but within just a few years, they surpassed him completely, especially in the American market he could never conquer. John Lennon even dismissed Cliff's music as too clean to be real rock and roll. Cliff never responded publicly. Silence had become part of who he was. In 1965, Cliff attended a Billy Graham crusade in Britain and became a born-again Christian. The experience changed him deeply. For a time, he even considered leaving music behind to become a religious teacher. Instead, he stayed in show business, but his faith would guide every part of his private life for the next 6 decades. Years later, another heartbreak arrived quietly. His mother, Dorothy, developed Alzheimer's disease. Slowly, she stopped recognizing her famous son. Cliff still visited her constantly, singing old songs beside her bed. Sometimes she looked at him like he was a complete stranger. On stage, tens of thousands still shouted his name. But inside that nursing home room, the woman who gave birth to him no longer knew who he was. By then, Cliff had become familiar with loss, familiar with loneliness, familiar with feeling unseen even in front of crowds. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for what happened in August 2014. The helicopter and the TV screen. The day it all collapsed. On August 14, 2014, Cliff Richard was relaxing at his apartment in Portugal when he turned on the television and saw police raiding a house live on the news. A helicopter circled overhead. Officers moved room to room. Then Cliff realized the house on the screen was his own home in Berkshire. Nobody had warned him. Not the police, not the media. He discovered it the same way millions of viewers did, watching live television. The allegation traced back nearly 30 years earlier to a Billy Graham event at a football stadium in Sheffield in 1985. A teenage boy who attended that gathering later accused Cliff Richard of abuse. The irony was devastating. Billy Graham was also the man whose crusade had inspired Cliff's Christian faith back in 1965. The same faith that shaped Cliff's entire adult life had now become tied to the accusation threatening to destroy him. At the time, British police were aggressively reopening historical abuse investigations after the Jimmy Savile scandal. Cliff immediately denied the allegations and would continue denying them for years. But what shocked the public most was the media involvement. A BBC reporter learned about the investigation before the raid. According to later court testimony, police secretly informed the BBC about the exact timing of the search. On the day of the raid, BBC helicopters were already waiting overhead before officers even arrived. Millions watched as Cliff Richard's home was searched live on national television. Legal experts later said he was treated like a dangerous criminal before ever being charged with anything. Back in Portugal, Cliff made his first phone call. Not to a lawyer, but to his closest friend, who reportedly flew out immediately just to sit beside him. According to sources close to Cliff, the two men spent the entire night staring silently at the ocean. Rumors later spread that Paul McCartney privately sent Cliff a handwritten letter of support. Cliff reportedly still keeps it today. For nearly 2 years, the investigation hung over his life. Cliff continued denying every accusation. Then, on June 16, 2016, prosecutors officially announced there was not enough evidence to charge him. Cliff Richard was never arrested, never charged. Legally, he was cleared completely. But the damage had already been done. Those 22 months changed him forever. And according to people close to him, a part of Cliff Richard never truly came back after that day in Portugal. When an innocent man still pays the price. The 22-month aftermath. In 2016, prosecutors officially announced there was not enough evidence to charge Cliff Richard. Legally, he was cleared, but the real damage had already happened during the 22 months before that decision. Within weeks of the police raid, Cliff's health began collapsing. He lost weight rapidly from stress. He developed a painful case of shingles, a condition often linked to emotional trauma. He struggled to sleep, and when he finally did, he woke up panicking, replaying imaginary conversations in his head. Later in court, Cliff admitted there were moments he thought he was having a heart attack or a stroke. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The cruelest part was that he knew he was innocent, yet his body still reacted as if his entire world was falling apart. For months after the raid, he reportedly could barely eat. Meals would be placed in front of him, but he would simply stare at the plate and put his fork back down. A man who had once performed for packed stadiums could no longer force himself to finish dinner. Then came Christmas Eve, 2014. The singer who had dominated British Christmas music for decades sat alone in his Portugal home. No guests, no celebration, no music. For the first time in nearly 60 years, Cliff Richard did not sing on Christmas Eve. He never moved back into the house police raided. He later described it as contaminated. He said it felt even worse than being robbed, because this violation had been broadcast live to the entire country. After prosecutors cleared him, Cliff sued both the BBC and South Yorkshire Police. The case went to the High Court in 2018. On July 18th, the judge ruled that the BBC had seriously violated Cliff's privacy through sensationalist reporting. The network was ordered to pay massive damages and legal costs. When the verdict was read, Cliff broke down crying in court. It was one of the few times the public had ever seen him completely lose composure. Later, reporters asked why he filed the lawsuit. Cliff said it was never about money. He wanted to protect other people from going through the same thing. He believed no one should be publicly exposed before being officially charged with a crime. The case ultimately changed how the British media reports criminal investigations. Cliff won in court, but he could never recover those lost years. And after everything was over, one painful question continued haunting him. If you spend your entire life alone, who stands beside you when your world finally collapses? 4 women, 1 proposal, and the man who shared his home for 20 years. Cliff Richard sold more than 250 million records and spent 7 decades as one of the world's most recognizable entertainers. But he never got married. He never became a father. And now, at 85 years old, he has quietly admitted that he sometimes wonders if he made the wrong choice. It's important to understand this wasn't a man nobody wanted. Cliff had plenty of chances at love. He simply kept saying no. Over the years, he gave 4 main reasons. His Christian faith made him view marriage as a lifelong commitment, and he didn't believe that fit the life of a touring musician. His career always came first. He valued his independence. And deep down, he feared divorce. But behind those careful explanations were several women who deeply shaped his life. The first was Olivia Newton-John. In the 1970s, Cliff reportedly fell deeply in love with her. According to longtime rumors, he even wrote her a love letter he never sent. Eventually, Olivia married Bruce Welch, who happened to be Cliff's close friend and bandmate from the Shadows. Cliff and Olivia remained close friends for decades. Before her death in 2022, the two reportedly shared one final private phone call. Afterward, Cliff disappeared from public performances for weeks. Then there was Sue Barker. Years later, Sue revealed that Cliff once proposed to her, and she turned him down. According to her, she realized Cliff would never fully belong to another person. The stage would always come first. They stayed close friends for the rest of their lives. Another important figure was Diana, Princess of Wales. For years, rumors surrounded their unusually close friendship. Some reports claimed Diana would call Cliff late at night while struggling through the collapse of her marriage. Cliff never publicly discussed those conversations. Two of the most famous people in Britain, both surrounded by millions, both privately lonely. Then there was John Macklin, an American former priest who lived with Cliff for more than 20 years. The public constantly speculated about their relationship, but Cliff always gave the same short response. "He is my companion." They shared homes, meals, and daily life together. But even with companionship, Cliff still spoke openly about loneliness later in life. Because there is a difference between having someone nearby and feeling fully understood. In one recent interview, Cliff admitted something deeply personal. He said he sometimes feared he would never experience the kind of love that comes from having a real family around you every day. "There are quiet nights," he said, "where I wonder what it would be like to have someone there." Coming from an 80-year-old man, it sounded less like regret and more like a realization arriving too late. And now, at 85, that silence around him feels even heavier. Sunrise alone, facing the inevitable. In recent years, Cliff Richard has spent most of his time between Portugal and Barbados. In the Algarve, he owned a vineyard called Vida Nova, which means new life in Portuguese. The name reflected exactly what he was trying to build after the scandal that nearly destroyed him. Locals in Portugal often spotted Cliff walking alone at sunrise along the coast. No security, no entourage, just an aging music legend quietly watching the ocean. After a lifetime of fame, this was the life he chose for himself: silence, sea air, and distance from the spotlight. Then, in late 2024, Cliff received another shock. Doctors discovered he had prostate cancer during a routine medical check required for tour insurance. Without that requirement, he likely never would have gone to the doctor at all. According to people close to him, when Cliff heard the diagnosis, his first reaction was to apologize to the doctor for causing trouble. That was who he had become. During the early months, he told almost nobody about the illness. Only one person reportedly stayed beside him through hospital visits: John Macklin. The night before surgery, Cliff quietly rewrote his will. Fortunately, the cancer had not spread. In December 2025, Cliff publicly revealed he was temporarily cancer-free. But even then, he spoke carefully, urging people to get regular health checks instead of celebrating himself. Around the same time, he performed at the Brighton Center. Fans noticed his body looked weaker and his voice sounded fragile when he spoke between songs. But once the music started, something changed. In the middle of one performance, his voice cracked. Cliff stopped singing for a moment, and the audience immediately rose to their feet, giving him a long standing ovation. When reporters later asked about retirement, Cliff gave an answer that revealed everything about his mindset. "I'm not retiring," he said. "I'm just stopping." To him, retirement sounded final. Stopping meant there was still a chance he could come back one more time. Inside Cliff's home in Portugal, there is reportedly an empty bedroom that always remains prepared for someone. Cliff has never explained who it is for. Maybe family. Maybe guests. Maybe someone he once loved. Or maybe it represents the life he never built. And nearby sits the same guitar his father bought him when he was 16 years old. One object symbolizes everything he achieved. The other symbolizes what he never had. His father died before seeing his son become a legend. And now, decades later, Cliff Richard is still standing on stage, singing to thousands of people while the room beside him remains empty. He sold 250 million records. But younger generations barely know his name anymore. At 85 years old, the stage is still the only place where he truly feels less alone. Cliff Richard had it all: the fame, the money, the respect of the Queen of England. But at the end of his life, inside a quiet, sprawling house in Portugal, a 69-year-old guitar sits next to an empty bedroom that is still waiting for someone who is never going to arrive. Sometimes, true loneliness isn't just about not having someone by your side. It's the crushing realization that you traded something away, and you can never, ever get it back. If he could go back to being 25, do you think Cliff Richard would choose a family or his career? Let us know in the comments below. And if this video reminded you of a legend in your own life, share their name with us.